Jesse James was no stranger to bloodshed. As the sun dipped below the Missouri horizon, he rode hard through the thick brush, his breath ragged, his sides slick with blood. Behind him, the war had ended. The Confederacy had fallen. But Jesse wasn't running from a battlefield. He was running from something far worse. Unionist militias, determined to hunt down the remnants of Confederate guerrilla fighters, had nearly killed him. Ambushed, shot, and left for dead, Jesse had barely escaped. But as he clutched his reins, pushing his horse forward, one thing became clear. His war wasn't over. Jesse James didn't become an outlaw overnight. His journey from rebel soldier to America's most notorious bandit wasn't about greed or lawlessness. It was about vengeance, survival, and a refusal to surrender to a world that had no place for men like him. This is the story of how Jesse James became an outlaw. Before we uncover Jesse James's transformation, take a moment to support the Forgotten History channel. If you love discovering hidden stories from the past, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us bring history's untold stories to life. Now let's step back in time and witness the moment Jesse James made the choice that would define his future. In the spring of 1865, the Civil War came to an end. The Confederacy collapsed, its armies surrendered, and across the South, rebel fighters laid down their arms. But not everyone accepted defeat. For Jesse James and the guerrilla fighters who had waged a ruthless war in the Missouri backwoods, surrender meant humiliation, or worse. Many of his fellow raiders vanished into the frontier, seeking to escape Union retribution. Others tried to reintegrate into a world that no longer wanted them. But Jesse? He refused to run. He refused to beg for mercy. Jesse and a small band of ex-Confederate raiders held on to their weapons, convinced that the war was not truly over. They had fought not on battlefields, but in the shadows, striking at Union forces and disappearing into the hills. To them, the enemy was still out there, and so was their cause. But the Union had its own plans. Federal troops and Unionist militias swept across Missouri, hunting down the last of the guerrillas. If Jesse wanted to survive, he would have to fight for more than just the Confederacy. He would have to fight for his very existence. Jesse James learned the cost of defiance the hard way. Near the end of the war, Jesse attempted to surrender. He rode toward the small town of Lexington, Missouri, unarmed, believing he would be treated fairly. But the Unionists waiting for him had no interest in mercy. They surrounded him, ripped him from his horse, and beat him savagely. Then, with Jesse barely conscious, they raised their rifles and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through his chest. He fell, left for dead in the dirt. But Jesse James didn't die. His body was broken, but his will remained unshaken. As he clawed his way back to his family's farm, bleeding and feverish, a fire burned inside him. This wasn't surrender. This was war, and Jesse James would never be a victim again. Jesse returned home a different man. The boy who had left to fight for the South had been replaced by someone harder, colder, a man who had seen the true cost of defeat. But there was no peace waiting for him. Missouri had changed. The Union was in control now, and former Confederates were treated as second-class citizens. Their land was confiscated, their rights stripped away. Jesse's family was no exception. His mother, Zerelda, fought to keep their farm, but Union loyalists harassed them at every turn. Everywhere Jesse looked, the people he had once called neighbors now saw him as an enemy. The government that had won the war wasn't interested in reconciliation. It was interested in control. For Jesse James, the war had never ended. It had simply changed shape. And if he couldn't live as a free man under Union rule, he would live outside the law. Jesse wasn't the only James brother who refused to surrender. Frank James had fought in some of the most brutal guerrilla campaigns of the Civil War, riding with William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. Unlike Jesse, who had been wounded and left behind, Frank had kept fighting until the very end. And when he finally returned home, he didn't come alone. Frank brought with him the only men he could still trust, ex-Confederate raiders, hardened by years of bloodshed. These were men who had never known anything but war, men who refused to kneel to the Union's rule. Jesse, still recovering from his near-fatal wound, looked up to his older brother. If anyone had the answer to survival in this new world, it was Frank. And Frank had no doubts. The war wasn't over. They would fight the only way they knew how. But this time, the enemy wouldn't be Union soldiers. It would be the banks, the railroads, and the men who had built their wealth on the ruins of the South. For men like Jesse and Frank James, there was no future in the new America. The Union had won the war, but their victory came with consequences. Ex-Confederates were barred from voting, blacklisted from good jobs, and watched closely by federal authorities. Jesse had once believed he could return home and start over. But now he saw the truth. There was nothing left for him. His family's farm was barely surviving, and every time he stepped into town, he could feel the eyes of Union loyalists watching him. For Jesse, the message was clear. He had no place in this world. If he couldn't live by the law, then he would live outside of it. And Frank had just the plan to make that happen. On February 13th, 1866, Jesse James crossed the final line. The target was the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, a bank known for holding Union money. Frank and his men had planned everything. The town was quiet. The bank was lightly guarded. It should have been simple. But Jesse didn't just want to rob the bank. He wanted to send a message. The gang stormed inside, revolvers drawn. In a matter of minutes, they emptied the vault, stuffing thousands of dollars into their saddlebags. But as they rode out, gunfire erupted in the streets. A young college student, caught in the chaos, was shot and killed. It was the first daylight bank robbery in American history. And now, Jesse James wasn't just an ex-Confederate or a desperate man trying to survive. He was something else entirely. He was an outlaw. The morning after the Clay County bank robbery, Missouri awoke to shocking news. A gang of armed men had stormed into Liberty's most trusted bank, stealing thousands of dollars and leaving a young man dead in the street. In an instant, the peaceful town had been turned into a battlefield. But this wasn't just any robbery. The authorities quickly realized who was behind it. Jesse James had crossed the final line. For the first time, his name appeared in newspapers across Missouri. Witnesses claimed they saw a young, battle-hardened ex-Confederate among the raiders. Some even said he smiled as he rode away, dust kicking up behind him. The law wasted no time. A manhunt began, and Jesse James was officially a wanted fugitive. He could have run. He could have disappeared into the West like so many others before him. But Jesse wasn't done. This wasn't about escape. This was about making a statement. The Union had stolen his future. Now he would take something back. Jesse James never saw himself as a common thief. To him, robbing banks wasn't about money. It was about revenge. The Clay County Savings Association had financed the Union war effort, profiting off the defeat of the South. As far as Jesse was concerned, they weren't victims. They were enemies. Newspapers painted him as a dangerous criminal, but among former Confederates, Jesse became something else, a symbol of defiance, a man who refused to bow to the Union. He wasn't robbing for greed. He was robbing for a cause. Or at least that's what he told himself. But the truth was more complicated. As the money poured in, Jesse and his gang began targeting banks and railroads across Missouri. The more they stole, the more powerful they became. The vengeance Jesse once clung to slowly blurred into something else, something darker. Jesse wasn't just fighting back, he was enjoying it. With each new robbery, Jesse James's name spread farther. At first, he was just another outlaw, but as his crimes became bolder, the newspapers transformed him into something greater. The Robin Hood of the West, some called him, a hero to the Southern cause, a gunslinger who defied the North and took what was his. The reality, of course, was much different. Jesse didn't steal from the rich to give to the poor. He stole to survive. But the story was bigger than the truth, and Jesse James knew how to play the role. He wrote letters to the newspapers, taunting lawmen and declaring himself a fighter for Southern justice. He let the legend grow, knowing that the more people believed in it, the harder it would be for the law to bring him down. He had begun as a soldier. He had become a fugitive. Now, he was an icon. Jesse James didn't set out to become an outlaw. He was a soldier, a young man shaped by war, loyalty, and the desperate need to survive. But when the war ended, the world gave him no place to belong. The Union's victory wasn't just a defeat for the Confederacy. It was a death sentence for men like Jesse. Shot and left for dead, stripped of his home, and pushed into a life without options, Jesse made a choice. He could have accepted his fate, disappeared into obscurity like so many others. But Jesse James had never known surrender, and so he fought. The banks, the railroads, the law, they became his new battlefield. With every heist, his legend grew. With every escape, the myth of Jesse James took shape. But was he truly a hero, or just a man who refused to let go of the past? History would remember Jesse James as a legend, but legends are born from choices. And for Jesse, it all started with a single moment, the moment he decided to never stop fighting.